This is Mr. Matthews, and these are your notes on cycles. Today's topic in class will be covering mostly the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Of course, there's for all the elements that we talk about, there's a cycle for that. But the two most important ones are carbon and nitrogen, in referencing biology. But I want to start with just what is the generalized form of a cycle for a chemical. And we want to keep in mind that when we talk about chemicals that are needed for life, certain elements, we refer to the reservoirs as the places where we find them. So we're going to find things in the atmosphere and soils and land and the ocean. And this idea, this word called flux, is the process where these chemicals go from one reservoir to the next. Okay, so if we have flux, if we have transition by physical processes, the whole idea is that something like carbon is going to transition by weathering, by erosion, by evaporation, or even by what's called lithification. If you've ever seen like a sedimentary rock, that's an example of like lithification, where eventually sediments get compacted under pressure. Over long periods of time, they kind of form solid rocks. So, sedimentary rocks, or anytime you find fossils, that's an example of lithification. We also have flux by organisms through assimilation. And assimilation is when you just kind of uptake something by things like biosynthesis, something like photosynthesis, by decay, or by respiration. These are all ways that living like organisms participate in the flux process of transferring one of these chemicals from one reservoir to the next. So we look at our second question: why is knowing about cycles important to biology? Well, the elements within the cycles must be available for organisms. I mean, we have to have. We're going to say must here. We have to have carbon, we have to have oxygen, we have to have those things available just for life to exist. So it's important that we just kind of, we note that when we talk about how carbon and oxygen and nitrogen and sulfur, they all get, transferred from one reservoir to the next. But if we're looking at, why we're studying these in biology on top of just because they're important for life, humans, and it all goes back to humans have really disrupted these cycles through mining, through combustion, through pollution, and it's this disruption that we really kind of study and we can try and predict. And we look at disrupting one cycle. It's just like a food chain or food web. So when we disrupt one cycle, we're going to have, really some global consequences here. And for example, China adding sulfur to the atmosphere, U.S. adding DDT to the water, or we had that, the cats parachuting in Borneo. There's global consequences when we disrupt just one of the cycles. So why are they called cycles? Because the elements are carried through the cycles by the processes. The elements are definitely not, we say, used up. Okay, so elements are not used up and they just flux from one reservoir to the next. And if we want to look at just how many chemicals we're talking about, technically we have about 103 elements in nature, and about 24 of those are found in living things. So the 6 elements that are the building blocks of life, and what we really concentrate in biology we call them CHNOPS. Okay, CHNOPS: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And that's really important to know. CHNOPS. We're going to be talking a lot about these elements throughout the rest of the year. Today we're going to be mostly covering the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. But these 6 elements are really the building blocks of life. Carbohydrates are carbon-based, proteins, lipids are all going to have these types of nucleic acids. have all of these elements in them. So if we look at these big six, and we call them macronutrients, okay? Macronutrients, let's start with carbon here. So really, carbon is the main component of organic compounds, and technically anything that's considered organic has carbon. And so, if we have carbon plus hydrogen plus oxygen here, that's going to give us carbohydrates, and that's the energy molecule of life. That provides calories. That's going to give us energy to move and breathe and all of that. So carbon's the first one. So hydrogen, whoops. Hydrogen is also very important. So carbon, hydrogen, and then we get nitrogen. Whoops, there we go. Let me just do a little bit of formatting here as we go throughout this. But, nitrogen plus carbon and hydrogen and oxygen gives you protein. So nitrogen is not only is it, made up of, or not only is it beneficial for proteins, we actually see nitrogen in DNA and nucleic acids. So oxygen, kind of hit on that earlier. It's when you add oxygen to hydrogen and carbon, we get carbohydrates. That's very important. It's part of water, of course. All living things need water. And then we go to phosphorus. So phosphorus we do find in DNA, but more importantly, phosphorus is the energy element. We talk about ATP. That's phosphorus. All right, adenosine triphosphate. That P is really important. So we breathe and we eat to make ATP, to make that phosphorus molecule. And when we break apart that ATP, that gives us energy for life. So phosphorus, of course, is extremely important in just about everything we do. Sulfur. People always ask me as a teacher, what does sulfur have to do with anything? Well, sulfur is important because it helps give proteins our 3D shape. And of course, proteins are really not, they really provide the structure and for all life. So here we have our big six: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. All right, ChinOps. I kind of got that a little backwards there, but the easy way, ChinOps. And I'll probably ask you that, on a test. But here we have some macronutrients as well. All right, some things that are really important that we find in smaller amounts. The first one is calcium. All right, that's why it's important to, if you don't drink milk, which is fine, you can get calcium from other ways, but that's important for bones and, of course, for plants. That helps make up the wood part of trees, shells. Very important. Calcium's a really important part. We also have potassium. It's used in nerve cells. It helps us flood our nerve endings and really transmit that message from one nerve cell to the next. And then, of course, iron. And if you're iron deficient, that's not good. You probably have reduced energy because it helps attach oxygen to our red blood cells, which then take it to our mitochondria so we can make ATP. So iron plays a real key part. And then there's some things that we find in trace amounts: iodine, sodium, zinc, and copper that can be important. Just a couple of rules about biogeochemical cycles. The first one, cycles of metals. I think I've alluded to this with a few people. Never have a gaseous phase. And you'll learn about this in earth science, but things like phosphorus, you don't have a gas, we don't have phosphorus gas, but we do have, those non-metals do have a gaseous phase. Nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, you can have that phase. And that's important because then you ask, how do you get phosphorus? Well, we really look to, the erosion of rocks and in the soil runoff, which gets into the water, but particularly the erosion piece that gets into the soil. That's where we get phosphorus uptake from the soil and plants, and then we consume phosphorus. So that's good for us. Elements with a gas stage cycle, their flux is a little faster. They cycle faster through. So phosphorus is a little slower to flux all the way through the atmosphere, soil and land, and the oceans. Third one, elements that move slowly and don't have a gas stage tend to be limiting factors. For instance, plants can't get enough phosphate, all right, because it lacks the gaseous phase. You're very limited in where you can actually access phosphorus. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, cycles, all these can occur within one ecosystem. We can have all through reservoirs within an ecosystem, and normally chemicals leak out of ecosystems, and of course they must be replaced if the ecosystem wants to survive. But they can occur all within one. You can have the atmosphere, land, and water all within one, interacting with each other. The third one, energy must be added to ecosystems to get things moving. So sunlight or heat, one of the two, makes it moving. All right. We also say that energy flows. Energy flows, through the chemical cycle. Again, just energy is added, energy flows, and that makes flux happen a little bit. And lastly, life forms have greatly altered the biogeochemical cycles. So for instance, plants really kind of got this, plants and cyanobacteria have added oxygen, to the atmosphere. And think about the ramifications of that. Just having oxygen added to the atmosphere allowed animals to evolve. So and then now that animals have evolved, we've created humans that have greatly impacted our flux and our cycles, and had some really disastrous global consequences from that. But just a little bit about all the cycles. We'll get more into the carbon cycle, which you see here, and the nitrogen cycle, and all those terms throughout the course of the lab. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.